it's the loss of the conventional structure that is the key. The conventional structure consists of a dualistic division between a knowing subject, this body mind, and the objectivity of a universe in which I function, which is everything outside of me that I interact with and interface with as I'm doing my pleasurizing and, you know, dancing around naked in the fire, or whatever the hell they do, right? The point at which that structure, the subject and the object, are undermined and dissolve and disappear into a secret ingredient, which is inherently open and inherently infinite, where the ecstatic takes on new meaning. That's the point of transition between ordinary activity, where this body mind is just doing whatever the fuck it wants, having a good time, whooping it up in my hedonistic ecstasy. And I am not against the hedonistic ecstasy. What I am against is the conventional mindset. Right. So where the traditions of all these dark practitioners coming from these sort of nihilistic and atheistic points of view might touch the trajectory of where I'm going and where we might go there together, is in that point where you lose literally everything that is self and other than self into the non-dual. And that's really the issue. How can human experience as it is be used as a path? You know, that is the main question. Without running away from human experience or getting trapped in human experience, those being the two extremes.
Yeah.
Right? How can your sense fields and central nervous system, exactly as they're performing right now, be utilized for a type of inquiry that at the same time does not become self-indulgent or escapist? How does this reality become a path? That's the question.
That's what I'm constantly questioning, and that's why I keep hopping all over the place, because it seems like every time I feel like I've found something that's leading towards the answers that I'm looking for, I realize it's leading to what's basically, you know, a very small singular concept of something that, you know, as you said, just sort of ends in just playing your own games or whatever, you know, where it's like you stop questioning the whole and start focusing on some chunk of it that you've designated as being perfection, and then you're left in your own sort of cycle of nothing happening anymore. So then that's where I just say, okay, well, let me try something different now. And I still have yet to find a place that leads me to constantly questioning everything while still feeling like there's some foundation that I'm building underneath of myself, coming out of what, you know, we were saying a little while ago, where, you know, what do you learn that you feel like you're learning it towards a whole and not just like making a mess and playing games, you know?
Well, I think that the problem arises in the instance that a mental construct becomes sealed in your grasp. In the instance that you think you know what it is that you're looking for, and you formed a mental construct of it, that's the beginning of the end.
Yeah.
Because what you formed and what you've grasped as a mental construct is just a finite piece of mind work. That can't be the answer, right? So mental constructs become the obstruction, the direction. I mean, either you're interested in the infinite, which is open-ended, which cannot fail. Interest in the infinite cannot fail.
Yeah.
But getting trapped in the finite along the way will always fail.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Right. So, but since that your experience is composed of finite states, right? How do these two manage to work together so that you know what you're doing and can actually progress and can actually cultivate something and discipline yourself? Because I think that's really the key here, is having an actual discipline and not just a vague series of ideas, but at the same time, not get claustrophobically trapped in your discipline and have a very, very vivid, specific trajectory and aim and series of goals, but at the same time not lock them into philosophy where they get eaten and shit out of an intellectual process that ultimately confuses you and makes your suffering worse.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you think there's benefit to like learning a lot of foundational elements of different traditions at all? Or do you think, like, because I know you've said that you have a lot of experience in different traditions that you focused on over the years. And so like, is that necessary for where you're at right now, or could you have bypassed that whole learning period and come to the realizations that you're finding now and just started there, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I don't know, because I think that you have to take this on a case by case basis based on each individual's predilections. So I cannot say that it has to be a certain way and one must check off certain boxes in order to be whole at the end of the day. I have no idea. But it seems, the way that you're asking the question, that one intelligent way to handle the issue would be to have a good, strong preliminary period of inquiry where one spends a couple of years at the very least tasting various systems and seeing what their character is and seeing where they go and observing them, right? And what I've found is that the best thing for most people would be to set a cap on this comparative tasting preliminary period of their life. Like, say, I will spend the next year or 2 years doing that, and then I will force myself to make some kind of choice. Because it's very much like when you get to a certain point in your development, the tasting of different things can become its own trap.
That's the constant thing that I'm fighting, like, because on the one hand, you know, my diving into different territories lets me say, like, oh, what you're talking about with the Sephiroth, okay, I learned some of that through Quaria, or what you're talking about with like other elements of this that it's harder for me to put my finger on, that's what I'm learning about through Tantra. And you know, it's like, if I didn't have a base understanding of these different systems, I wouldn't realize where the foundations of things are coming from. But I don't know if I need to know where the foundations are coming from if I find something that's worth sticking with. But if I haven't compared it to anything else, how do I know if that's the one that really resonates with me? It's really complicated.
Yes, but I think that a few years of tasting various things and asking yourself the question on an almost daily basis, what is right for your disposition, and what is real and what is fantasy. You know, this is something that for most people is a necessity to some degree. I would hesitate to say that I have the answer for anybody, but it seems like certainly a damn good starting point that you get an education first. The type of education that I think ultimately, and this is another thing that makes it really difficult for people, that I don't think you can get tastes of these things through books. I think you actually have to have living experiences with practitioners of these systems to know what they're all about, because the books are written to portray the system in a certain way. You can't help it.
So are you familiar with Quaria, since I keep mentioning that? Are you familiar with that system?
I know of Josephine McCarthy and her system somewhat.
Okay. Yeah. So like what you're saying is really the problem that I'm having. Like, I have to fully invest all of my trust and confidence and understanding and educational path into Josephine without ever having spoken a word to her and having never witnessed her doing anything with anybody. You know, I just have to say, okay, I bought this book, now I trust Josephine. And that seems almost impossible for my sensibilities.
Right.
So I just keep like listening to interviews that she does, like trying to make a connection to her. And it's like, this doesn't work. Like, not for me at least. Like, I have, like you're saying, you can't just, or I don't feel that I can just pick up a book and gain everything that I need just by going through the steps of the book. There's no interaction with the world around me. There is through the exercises, but again, I'm reading those directly off of paper, doing those things in my own room by myself, and there's no reciprocation to it in any way. There's no give and take. There's no critiquing. There's no, like, I don't know if a guru is something that one must have, but the total absence of one seems to be problematic. So yeah, that's why I left that, and I still wish, I still would like to keep learning her system, but I don't feel that it's something that I can live within without having contact to anybody else.
Well, it all depends who you talk to. And I am a traditionalist. I'm a radical in a certain sense, and I don't belong to any system, but I'm a traditionalist in many ways as well. And all of the systems that have gone into my own training were traditional systems where it was mouth to ear oral tradition that actually passed the transmission of what a lineage had to offer intergenerationally.
Mm-hmm.
So that if you read it in a book, that's all well and good. You go meet the person. And if there's a connection with that person, if you end up working with them, what you get cannot be codified in terms of information, data. What you get as a living transmission is a mode of being with certain feeling tones that has its aims and goals built into how it feels. So it's guided in a certain direction, substantiated by its textures and living qualities. And you could only get that from interacting with another human being. And it's like the concept of two tuning forks, right? You hit one and it resonates the note. The other one doesn't even have to touch it. It just comes near it and it starts ringing as well.
Yeah.
And the ring, without touching, passes from one to the other just from the vibratory resonance field of its assertion. And the other one starts ringing. And then it can then pass it down the line, et cetera, and so forth. So there's that. Then there's also the idea that when you meet a real, sincere, authentic practitioner of any of these systems, they are the living embodiment of the system.
Yeah.
So if you want to learn about the system, you could read all kinds of books, but there are certain things that you'll only get by observing the living expression and see what that's really like, you know, in actuality. So we're not just talking about a guru here. What we're talking about is any living exponent of the system should tell somewhat of the story, right? They're just meeting practitioners and saying who's full of shit and who's for real.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
you just feel that out.
Yeah, it feels like a thing that you can come to a conclusion pretty quickly if you have, I don't know, the right eye for it. Where, you know,
you gotta do a lot of footwork.
Yeah.
You know, like, for example, the view that I hold, for the most part, is shared by a number of lineages from very, very different systems. There's a Kashmiri Shaivite system, there's the Nath lineage, there's certain Sufi lineages, very few Jews, but it exists within Kabbalah somewhat, and certain forms of Christian mysticism actually hold very similar views to the one that I hold. It doesn't mean that the systems connect. It doesn't mean that the systems have anything to do with each other at all, right? The thing that I'm interested in, that I'm talking about, is in the elusive outer limits of what happens in practice on very subtle levels, so much so that a good portion of the system becomes irrelevant.
Yeah.
Now, how would you ever know that? Unless you went to a place where people are obsessed and you throw yourself in, not a bunch of hobbyists, weekend participants, which is like the equivalent of going to church on Sunday.
Yeah.
Right. But go to a place where people have basically tossed everything in the fire except for the work. I am only interested in the place of intensity in any system where the work displaces all other concerns.
Yeah.
That's the starting point for where I become interested.
Yeah, that's resonating in the Fountain of Wisdom as I'm reading it, in your commentary on the Fountain of Wisdom, where it's like, you really are saying that, where you will realize that you are opening up to this thing when it becomes everything for you.
Right. Well, the alternative is for it to be just another concept amongst other concepts.
Yeah.
Like a philosophy.
Yeah.
And this is why the kind of radical mysticism that I talk about in my books is not just another philosophy. It might deal with philosophical concepts as methods from time to time, but it doesn't mean that it's merely just a philosophy. So I can't comment about Josephine's system at all, but there are places where you could meet practitioners devoting their entire lives to their practice. They exist. They exist in the United States. There are such communities, like the Hermitage, where I have my little hut and my teacher is, and I go frequently, is sustained. It sustains itself as a farm, that they have goats, they make cheese, they have a creamery, they make bread, they grow things and sell them, and these various agricultural type businesses generate sufficient income that the retreatants who only do practice can be supported, right? And then you get a lot of people who can't really be retreatants for one reason or another, and they work on the farm, and they have like basically happy lives, and they practice however they practice. But the whole point of the place is not to have a self-sustaining community. The point of the place is to support the retreatants.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is about the retreatants, right? Otherwise, it would just be another stupid agricultural community. I mean, you might as well be, a bunch of hippies or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you look into what the point of the whole thing is, meaning what the retreatants are actually doing, and then you meet a couple of them, and very often there can be fairly scary people, right? It's not easy to sit in a room with somebody like that, because chances are they don't want to talk to you for the most part. But if you can weasel your way into a sit down with such a person, you can get all the information that you need in a condensed form.
Yeah, well, it sort of makes sense to me from my own experience of trying to explain to people the different things that I'm learning and the different things that are going through my head. It's like I have to give them like 15 different examples of things that don't make sense to them at all when I'm saying it or when I'm finished. And it's like, okay, Michael. It's like, no, I just told you something very profound there. And they're like, if you say so, So I think that people, when they get used to having that reaction a couple of times, you stop spreading whatever you're thinking about to various random people, and it becomes more of as you said, so much of what happens has to happen internally, and it can't even necessarily be expressed when you're done. And that really resonated with me as a person that spends so much time by myself, that so much of this stuff is internal. But that's sort of different from where you're talking with being able to connect with these other people that have something to teach and a lineage to pass down. But it's not for everybody, for sure. And you have to have some level of insanity and open mind and willing to learn things that don't seem obviously necessary to learn or even possible to learn. There has to be a lot that comes together in a person's brain to get them to that point in life that they sit down to have that conversation.
Well, this is the major reason why I officially left the culture, and wanted nothing more to do with it except to take from it what I need to sustain my own retreat life, because I don't want to ever have to have that conversation ever again with anyone where I try to explain what is sublime and profound on the deepest possible level and have them go, well, okay,
Yeah,
half glazed over and not really caring, because the great majority of conventional human beings do not care, and they are only humoring you
yeah,
when they are listening. So why speak with them?
yeah,
Why? It's so demoralizing. It's such a losing battle that at a certain point, when you've had a few years of that, you just say, you know what? Fuck it. No more.
yeah,
It ends now. And that's on a larger scale, the way that the whole culture can be treated, right? Like when I was a kid, right, I had some serious issues, right? So they put me in a school, with other messed up kids. The majority of them were retarded, right? It was a day school. I went home at night.
Mhm.
And I was there from 1969 to 1976, my entire childhood, right?
Yeah,
And one thing I learned growing up like that is, if you spend all of your time trying to explain yourself to somebody who is actually literally retarded, you will get nowhere,
yeah,
right? So you might as well cultivate your own inner life without explanation, without excuses, without any need to even be expressed to anybody. It's none of anybody's business. And that's a pretty good way to live. I mean, because if the time comes when you have something that can actually benefit other people, that the expression of it becomes part of your work, you already know where it can go wrong,
yeah,
and where it can go wrong is the waste of your time.
yeah, yeah. That makes sense. For me, it feels like, oh, if I'm not going to get through to this person, maybe I'll have some sort of realization for myself. But usually I dumb down my own thought processes just by trying to explain them. And the person doesn't understand, and I feel worse for having tried to explain it.
Right, of course. I mean, what choice do you have? What choice do you have?
Yeah,
You're backed into a corner,
yeah. And
in that situation.
yeah, and so but that sort of concept seems to, I don't know, it comes out in your books, like that you're trying to find a way of explaining to people that do care, and yet that even when the person cares, it's still damn near impossible to explain the reality of reality without, just, so that's what I was saying, before we started recording, where it's like you've got the primary text of Fountain of Wisdom, you've got your commentary, you've got your esoteric cartography, where you're like, here's the words, here's my explanation of the words, here's a visualization of what I'm thinking these things mean, and hopefully all of that mixed in with your own brain stew will make something happen. Because if I just try to tell you straightforward all of this stuff, it's just not enough.
Yeah, and what allows that to work is the fact that I'm not doing it for me, and I'm not doing it for you, meaning the audience. That most people think that an artist in the contemporary sense is a careerist, right? They're doing
Yeah.
it for their own career, but they're also considering their audience. They're considering their public. Do they like it? Do they not like it? Right. And there's this weird dichotomy between trying to please those that consume what you do and doing it for yourself. So very often when artists show a sort of a contempt for the public or for their audience, the excuse is, oh, well, they're doing it just for themselves. The thing that allows me to do what I do is I'm not doing it for a public, and I'm not doing it for myself either. I'm doing it for the work, for the divine. And when I say divine, I'm not saying that in a theistic sense. We could talk about that quite a bit. And when I use the word divine, what I'm talking about is the infinite open expanse of pure possibility that inhabits all phenomena. Yeah. That's not a God, right? God is like a mythological byproduct of that is designated as a symbol by, a religious person. I'm not talking about that.
Yeah,
I'm talking about,
that's the thing that is so different about your work, where you come right up against that concept. And then just as people think that that's the direction you're getting ready to go, you stop us and say, that's not what I mean. That thing doesn't exist.
Right.
And it's like, whoa, I didn't think, because that's pretty much never the way your framework for things, and that simultaneously that discarding of the God element is like, I don't see that anywhere else really. There's always some grasping of it in some elusive way that you're just like, no, that is part of us, as that is part of me, which is part of everything, and it's all together, it's all not together, it's all here, it's all not here. It just is, and it's.
I think it's always been around, although at most points in history, it could get you killed for saying it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But I do think it's always been around, and I think that it is squarely at the heart of mystical systems in religious traditions. The Jews have a version of it. Sufism in Islam has a version of it. Vajrayana certainly has it. Hindu tantric lineages certainly have it. It's always been there. However, first of all, the difficulty of expressing it has always been present. It makes no conventional sense. Plus the fact that it gets you killed. You put those two things together, and
we're in a sort of religious renaissance right now, pretty much worldwide, where we can all have these conversations universally, internationally, and nobody really, for the most part, has to worry about that.
Nobody cares.
Yeah, this is one of the first times in history that that's a possibility, really.
That's right. Nobody cares. You can do anything you want. You can say anything you want on this subject. So I think, and I've always believed, that the next developmental wave of profound mysticism will come from atheists who no longer want a superficial existence, who no longer want to live superficially, and want to look into the profound inner reality of their own experience. The profound inner reality of their own experience doesn't necessarily have to be labeled as anything having to do with religious mythology whatsoever. As a matter of fact, the total rejection of religious mythology becomes a very good thing, because that's yet another layer of fantasy that becomes a trap. So you eliminate that one. What do you have left? Well, there, like you said, there really isn't a whole lot of literature or indications of what is left after that layer is removed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where I've been in flux for all of this time, where it's like, it's just like you're saying, is my trajectory of life, where I felt, there's something more, but it's not that, but I can't find it, so I just don't care. And then, years and years and years of unfulfillment in my life and lack of direction, and then just, you know it just got worse and worse. Just being this is what I've been saying for years. There needs to be some version of atheism that can be sustainable, that can feel fulfilling to yourself, to the people around you, to the reality of the world. You say, okay, I'm atheist. Now we have no more holidays. Now we have no more nothing to look to anywhere in any way. No connections to other people, no connections to history, no promises for the future, no anything is left when you say, okay, I'm an atheist now. And it feels nice from a scientific perspective getting into it, but after sitting in it for some years, it's like, this isn't enough for me. There's nothing here. And
Well, the starting point can be brought to the mentality that you're speaking of in terms of direct, immediate existentiality. The direct, immediate existentiality of your being in this moment, sitting there listening to me, has a texture, has a series of elusive feeling tones. It certainly has an accounting of all of its conventional elements, the substance of your flesh and bones and blood, where you are dimensionally, the time that you are expending as you are perceiving and conceptualizing about it, and finally the state of your being as a determination, whether you exist or not. So you have 5 categories here: substance, place, time, concept, being. They're all accounted for conventionally, where something appears somewhere at some time. You can think about it and determine that it either exists or doesn't exist. Like once that's automatic. You automatically orient yourself in that way from birth by virtue of being a human being.
yeah,
The questions that you're asking start after that mere accounting of phenomena becomes unsatisfactory
yeah,
to sum up the totality of what it means, right? What is this existential assertion of what is expressed? It can't merely just be those 5 things.
yeah, exactly.
There's got to be something more coming from the heart of the mystery that you are living through right now, but can't put your finger on exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
That's what we're speaking to.
yeah. I mean, the thing to me was like, just taking into account space and the possibility of other life forms is enough to just throw the whole thing out of whack for me. The fact that time isn't necessarily what we think it is, the universe isn't necessarily what we think it is, our connection to other life forms within our own sort of sphere of reality or on some alternate dimension, all of these things are possible, and there's really no room for that in just basic atheism. Like,
How about your own mind? You don't even know what that is.
yeah, well, yeah, and that's what I've said. The mind feels like a smaller version of what the universe is. This is what I've been saying for years. Like, it feels like the universe is just the inside of some mind of some giant that's in the inside of some planet that's in some other universe that's in this. It just feels like it's all like this is in that, is in that, is in that, is in that, and we could be just, there's so many ways to take it.
Well, at that point, you got to draw a distinction between the functional part of the mind that thinks and feels, which we could call the psyche, and pure awareness itself outside of that awareness doing anything, right? Like we know what it does as consciousness invests itself in the senses, in memory patterns, in understanding and accounting for all of the elements that we've spoken of. It moves around and forms thoughts and feelings. But what is the mind in itself outside of its functioning, right?
Yeah.
That question allows the mind to be treated in the exact same way that a religious person would treat God.
Yeah.
So, because ultimately your psyche is you, but the question of pure awareness is not you anymore, because your pure awareness is not any different from my pure awareness, is not any different from pure awareness before we were born or after we die. So outside of all of these concerns of function, of being this person or this mind or that mind, what is the pure awareness in the most profound sense? Well, once you've gotten enough of a taste of this style of inquiry, which doesn't come to any definite conclusions, quite the opposite, it poses just a series of questions.
Yeah.
Once you've bathed in the question, dived in, submerged yourself in the question enough that it's filled you utterly and completely, there's a great secret here that I could tell you exactly what it is. And either it's viable or it's not viable. That infinite expanse, when the questioning takes over, either you fall in love with it, really, truly fall in love with it, or you don't. And if you don't, then you care about other things. But if you care about that question more than anything else, and you literally fall in love with it, it becomes the sole aim of the trajectory of the entirety of your being. And then you become a practitioner.
Yeah.
So the question is, since that's obviously not for everybody, what kind of weirdo would end up like that? Well, in my experience, those weirdos are born and not made.
Yeah.
You know, like, I don't think you could make yourself like that. You either are one or you're not.
Yeah.
You know, like on the Hermitage that I described to you, where I go and live for part of the year, they grow things, right? And in the realm of growing things, you have natural mutations, natural forms that deviate from the ordinary ones. Like you could have a squash that comes out green and yellow. So all the squashes are a little bit green or a little bit yellow, right? And various combinations of that. But every once in a while, like certain species, it's very, very rare, like 1 out of 1,000,000 would come out purple, right? Like totally beyond the normal patterns that would grow in the natural variation of the species. The term that is used on the farm for that is, it's called a sport, right? It's the odd genetic element that is so far out of the configuration that it can't even be calculated. Or if it is calculated, it's in like the millions.
Yeah.
Well, that's what it's like to be somebody interested in the issue that we're talking about. You're a sport amongst the human crop of, you know, like the rest of the human squashes that run society, who are concerned with mostly what people are concerned with is acquiring pleasure and avoiding pain.
Yeah.
That's what it's about for most people. How do you find, they're not interested in meaning in their life. They're only interested in finding meaning in their life if it feels good and reinforces their sense of identity and blah, blah, blah. My children, I reproduce, and, you know, I've fulfilled my human function by virtue of the fact that I'm a link in the chain and my children grow up and there are no overt problems. There's no giant bear that's going to eat me, or we don't have some life-threatening illness, or and a nice house and a car.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like this conversation very much. I think that it, in addition to being useful for you and useful for me, it's really useful for other people to listen to these kinds of discussions, to know that such a thing is possible as what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Because how many times in a person's life do they hear that such possibilities might even exist?
Yeah, yeah, and that's the thing for me where my level of ignorance, I think, is it's bad when I'm trying to come to conclusions, but it's good when I can just sort of allow myself to hop into a conversation with somebody like you, where a lot of other people would probably think I have no business talking to somebody on your level.
Why is
But
that?
well, I
That's
mean,
not
that's
true.
what I think, though. When I watch a lot of interviews on esoteric commentary, whatever you want to say, whatever you want to call it, um, a lot of them go over my head. And I feel like sometimes you need an interviewer that's not also an expert, that can just ask the basic questions. And like, you might think, oh, that's a stupid question, but 500 people watching might think, I was wondering that same thing.
No, a stupid question is, what kind of sea creature would you want to be? So somebody recently asked me that.
Oh, goodness.
What you're asking me is highly intelligent. And you see, the thing is that technical esoteric discussions are really fucking boring. And
Yeah,
the actual discussions that are interesting are basic level discussions of what the hell do I do with my life?
yeah,
That's interesting. I mean,
yeah.
what you're posing here is far more interesting than some elaborate technical discussion.
Well, I'm glad you agree with that. I mean, that's what I've thought on an intuitive level. Like, there's a part of me that listens to these certain podcasts and shows, and I think, I don't know nearly as much as this person does. What business do I have talking to them? But then at the same time, it's like, I think they would appreciate talking to some, because when everybody isn't 30 years experienced in an order, most people aren't. And like you said, like, there people like us that have these interests are few and far between, and people that have actually taken years to get deep into the topics are much, much fewer. Most people would find these things interesting, but are still stuck in the 9 to 5 and don't have the ability to spend years to think about these things and go deeper. And in your case, write books on them. And in my case, just contemplate them and ask stupid questions that end up, I guess, being intuitive.
Well, the other thing is that the people who've been 30 years in order, who've lost touch with the initial question, what the hell am I doing with my life and why?
Yeah.
Many of those people are just as deluded as an ordinary person, but now they have this esoteric interest. And it's the losing touch with the original impulse of what the meaning of it all is that becomes the death. Just because you're in order for 30 years doesn't mean you've accomplished anything.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that the more profound part of the arc is that initial question of why, what for, what is the meaning of all of this? What do I do with this life? That is of ultimate profundity. And the people who think that they have answers are the most frozen up of all, a lot of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And, like what you're saying, I mean, I don't think you know this, but my education in like college was Greek and Roman history. And so like I did archaeology outside of, like, right outside of Rome. I dug one of the ancient cities that one of the original Roman kings had retreated to. So, I find parts of history that aren't explained and we're trying to explain to be like the basis of what drives me. And that one, like a archaeological and Roman level, there's that. But then on the Greek level, I found people like Socrates to be so interesting that just kept saying, okay, so what does that mean? And to the point where everybody around him went crazy, where it's like, okay, you've explained that, so what does that mean? And then you just keep taking it deeper and deeper and deeper. And you could just ask some random person on the street questions and they end up coming to profundities that people that consider themselves to be at the top of their order are like, oh, I'm not concerned with that. And then somebody like Socrates is like, okay, well then you're boring.
Yeah,
You know?
that's one reason, like I was telling you before, that I'm so interested in certain atheists, because what they do is use Socratic logical fallacies as a way of taking apart arguments and assertions,
Yeah.
especially exoteric religious assertions. And
Yeah.
I find it fascinating because once you ask the question and look for the answer, you have a really interesting issue. Unfortunately, the way that you validate an assertion that doesn't fall into one of the logical fallacies is through empirical observation and conclusions based on what has been observed. And that's where the Socratic method in the atheist community leads most people. What I find interesting is questioning the nature of even the most data-based empirical conclusion, right?
Yeah.
Like, for example, this glass seems to be itself. It seems to be a substance in a place at a certain time, right? That's the starting point for a discussion of existentiality, which the Socratic method cannot make inquiries about, because it can conclude certain things that I've just mentioned. But how do you know that the knowing and the thing being known are even structured in a way that the data that you think you're getting is even valid? Well, because I perceive it, you perceive it, it can be tested. We could put it through all these logical systems where we could derive conclusions from it. And at the end of the day, make so many tests and observe it from so many angles. And we all agree, well, what if we're all wrong?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's the thing where, I was thinking and hadn't got to that point yet. And I really can't go too deep into this, but the difference between Socrates and us is 2,000, 2,500 more years of science and inquiry and knowing things. And then all of a sudden we thought we knew everything. And then quantum physics came along and basically told us, you don't know anything at all, go back to Socrates. And I think that's where this whole thing is at right now, where these empirical answers aren't necessarily the answers anymore when you're looking at it through a quantum perspective, because that sort of re-dissects reality for us. And I don't know enough about quantum physics to get too deep on this, but I know enough to know that has turned the whole thing on its head.
Well, I know that conclusions and answers become mental constructs, and mental constructs are stoppage points for the mind. So the kind of path that I write about and talk about is far more interested in immersing in open-ended territories that are more like questions than answers.
Yeah.
And stoppage points are obstructions to this process. They obscure the trajectory of the streaming of mind into the infinite. And it's in that streaming that the textures of knowing, rather than objects that are formed by knowing as stoppage points, right? Data objects, information, right? It's far more in the pouring forth of mind going nowhere that the kind of stuff that I'm interested in is discovered. In other words, I'm not interested in any answers.
Yeah.
I don't care. I'm interested in the mind's dynamic outpouring into nothing.
Yeah, and to some extent, that's really all that matters, because like, oh, we figured out the Big Bang Theory, and it's like, okay, well, that's not the beginning of anything. Something exploded, and then all of this happened. So what exploded? And then you're right back to the beginning again. Where it's just like, what's the point in saying you have an answer when you know that you live in a reality that is so far outside of our concept, of our capacity to understand? And again, I just keep bringing it back to say, like, that's what is cool about your work, that you're like coming at this from so many different angles at once to try to show us that it's worth thinking about these things, and it's also worth realizing that we cannot come to conclusions, but the not having a conclusion is bliss in itself in a way.
Yeah, you know, the thing about the book that you're reading, the commentary on Fountain of Wisdom, is it's still, even if you read the entire thing, doesn't tell you what to do.
Yeah.
Right. It's not interested in saying, okay, all you got to do is draw a circle on the ground and you map out the quadrants and you say this name, you get this color, like your old experience in Wicca used to do.
Yeah.
You make the great right, you got the sword, you got the cup. Okay. Those are actually conventional activities. They could have interesting or profound implications as symbols, but they're still conventional activities. What is the only activity that escapes conventionality? Well, it's the facticity that occurs as knowing and the known explode into each other, crash into each other so that neither one can be grasped. That's non-conventional.
Yeah.
And we're doing it constantly. So you don't have to really have a fancy formula or method. You could, and they help from time to time, but the direction is inherent in our being. It's inherent in reality that is going on right now. What I'm talking about and writing about is not anything other than what is happening right now.
Yeah.
It's not elsewhere.
Yeah. And, you know, and like as I'm reading Fountain of Wisdom, I've been like, you know, thinking about like the idea of the mirror, I think is really interesting. And like, just from a very practical perspective, when you stand in front of a set of mirrors, like in a house of mirrors or something like that, the worlds around you are, it's insane to just think about that. Or like when you open up a window on a computer, like in my OBS software that I used to stream with, if you open up the screen, if you're showing the screen that has the software on it, you get infinite windows within windows within windows within windows that go down. And it's like, it's almost like reality itself can't even play itself out properly in our eyes or in our software that we've made or anything. I mean, I'm sure there's technical answers to these things, but it does make you think, like, you can just use a mirror and say like, oh, everything is part of something else, and which is the me looking or the me that's being seen the real me? And it gets really confusing.
Well, the hall of mirrors funhouse distortion that becomes ordinary human existence is habituated. It's like there's a register of this insanity of reductive distortions that reflect each other into infinity that we're so used to that we don't even question it, right? We just assume that the image that we get of it, that we're born with, that we're habituated into, is the correct one, right? Because everybody else shares some version of it. So we have a general agreement that we're all operating under certain generalities, but specifically, each vector is slightly different. And we can't even talk about that because we can't even say what is unique about our own because we can't compare it to anything else, like we said before. So on a general level, we just accept that the status quo of this funhouse hall of mirrors craziness, where all we know are the echoes of the, like in the Platonic sense, because you're a classical scholar, it's the shadows on the cave wall, right?
Exactly.
That's what you're stuck with. And if you don't question it, and that's the real for you, you are locked into a very specific register, and you are born and will die there, and with very little disturbance other than your own pleasure and pain.
Yeah.
But when you question that arrangement and that deal that you've gotten as maybe not such a good deal,
Yeah.
and maybe are shopping around for a better deal, then you know you are a consummate weirdo in the realm.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so strange to think of how many people just don't, you know, they don't take that extra step to say what's actually going on right now. You
No,
know, like what is
they
the
don't.
great, is there a greater meaning of this? Where do I fall into that? How am I part of this world? How am I part of this galaxy, this universe? What is the meaning of all of this? And people go through their entire life without ever asking that question once.
Yeah, I think the way you're talking to me right now, you should talk to a whole bunch of people like this and see what is said and feel what is to be felt, and asking yourself, pervasively, continually, the question, is this person I'm talking to full of crap, or are they authentic, or some mixture of the two? And in
Yeah,
what areas and in what ways? And how does this seem to present a series of options for my own life that offer a promise that the conventional sources of the use of my time have not yet provided, right?
yeah,
And what you will find is that the more you go into the realm of what is pretty rare, the more that you will know almost instantly if something is worth wasting your time on. And because you are actually refining what you're looking for,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
you keep going. And at a certain point, if you find a set of concerns that is worth falling in love with, and love is the means of proper use of one's time, it is the only indicator that you could possibly be doing the right thing with your life.
Yeah,
Right. And if you fall in love with the profound in an undifferentiated, open-ended way, which goes on and on and on forever, and there's no stoppage point like a Jesus or a Zeus or
yeah,
whatever it is, that you say all you got to do is love Big Daddy and Big Daddy will reward you, or you love the despair, the existential despair, because it seems like the answer for a lot of people whose religion is science is resigning themselves to the existential despair of their own nihilism.
yeah, yeah,
And that's not a really good solution, because basically that goes back to the pleasure principle of, well, I'm just going to um, make myself feel as good as possible for the rest of this life and then die, and my life wasn't anything really profound anyway. I'm just another ape,
yeah,
on the chain gang, just another ape on the assembly line, right? And this is where the excuses come for weird aberrant behavior that people use to justify their selfishness and their distorted qualities and their greed. All of a sudden they're on a stage jerking off a donkey, shoving grapes into their mouth or whatever it is. It's like that, like, how far can human depravity go before it realizes it's made a serious error
yeah,
about its own meaning, right?
yeah.
And maybe there's something about all those deluded religious people who somehow knew, hey, simplicity and honesty about one's state, at least they had that, you know,
Yeah.
at least they had the humility and honesty to say, I'm not the point.
So I guess I don't know where this will lead us, but I wonder how does what you just said feed into like global warming and our general pollution of the environment? Is it,
In my opinion,
yeah, where, like, how much of the blame falls on atheists, how much of the blame falls on theists? Is there anything that we can do, like, is this a thing that you think about? Because it's a thing that I think about all the time, and what your last sort of couple sentences there really led me into thinking, like, what does this mean for our future as humans on Earth?
well, I could give you my opinion on the subject, which is a pretty radical opinion, and it might not relate to yours or anyone else's. My own opinion is that I don't care. It's inconsequential for me what happens in the world of beings on a conventional level via the laws of physics, via the arc of history, in the same way that I don't care who's president, and I don't care what the culture is doing or what the zeitgeist is. It's not that I don't care out of coldness or callous self-interest. I don't care because I'm interested in something else. And I'm interested in that other thing to the exclusion of a lot of other things. Because I am so interested in what I have fallen in love with, which is literally falling into the infinite expanse of inquiry into the nature of reality, that my single pointed love has become insane. My single pointed love has driven me mad. And the madness takes the form of not caring about anything else. And I don't care about the culture. I don't care about the media. I don't care about politics. I don't care about philosophy. I don't really even care about what goes on in my neighbor's backyard unless it annoys me and prevents me from doing my work. So I can't.
That's what I was. That's why I was kind of asking like that, because I thought that might have been the direction that you would be leaning, where it's either you have some profound answer or you just don't care at all.
Yes, I don't care at all. I'm just saying it in the most polite way that I can.
No,
I really
fine.
don't care about. I mean, I don't care about it so much that while the whole shithouse goes down in flames, I will be dancing and experiencing bliss, you know, on the deck of the Titanic as it's sinking.
Yeah. Or in the Roman terms, you'll be Nero playing the flute while Rome burns around you.
Nero 666. Yeah, that's where that came from, by the way. So the whole thing about other concerns about things that change, right? Like when you look at the panoply of phenomena of circumstances that affect a human being, the one thing we could say about them all, these circumstances that affect human beings, is that they're all in the midst of constant change. What I have fallen in love with is the unchanging, right? That which doesn't change. And there's no quality or attribute about it at all. There's nothing you could say about it, except it is the very heart of everything else that seems to change.
Sense. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that would be your perspective, because, you know, if your focus is on, you know, the things that you're focused on, then the day-to-day interactions of human beings are just totally outside of that concept of, you know, there's really no point in going there. So that makes sense to me. But I thought maybe you would have something to, you know. So yeah, that's totally cool though.
Climate change,
and it does make sense.
The destruction of the culture. Do I have an opinion about these things?
Well, I mean, yeah, no, you don't have to, you know, if your point is that you don't think about it, then that's a good enough answer. It's just,
well, it's a good enough answer, but it's a little bit more complex than that, because of course I have opinions about these things. The reason why I'm not just blurting out my opinion is because far and away, the more important discussion is why I don't care.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
But that doesn't mean I don't have opinions, because I do. It's like I said, I don't care who's president, for example. Does that mean I don't have any political opinions? No, I have political opinions, but they're so inconsequential. It's like a fly landing on my arm.
Yeah.
You know,
well, that's something that I'm trying to train myself to sort of get into, or get into not caring, or get away from caring about that. And
I went through this. I did that.
Yeah.
What I did at a certain point is I set a boundary for myself where I would not take in any form of news about the outside world.
This is where I'm at right now.
Yeah, like when you get your email and they run the little thing on the bottom, I block it out by lowering the window. Yeah. I will not listen to anybody talking to me about current events, I will get up and leave.
Yeah.
Or I will politely explain to them where I'm at and please do not do this. And if they persist, well, I'm just not going to talk to them anymore. If they, keep on throwing in usually an anger infused set of opinions.
Yeah.
Now, on either side, it doesn't matter. Like, wacko psychotic liberal or wacko psychotic conservative conspiracy person. I don't care. It's the same fucking bullshit. Don't tell me about it.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing that resonated with me with Craig Williams, where he was saying that people replace when you're atheist, when you're secularist, you end up finding a different religion. If you don't have the right, if you aren't continuing down some path of gnosis, then you just start building a religion out of whatever else you find around you. So I very much, as I said, as I was sort of digging myself a hole of depression and intoxication, politics was my religion and mantra that I was heading down that hole right alongside, where it's like, that was the thing that I built to say, okay, well, if nothing matters, this is what matters.
Yeah,
and
the interesting
it took
thing,
a lot of work to get out of that thought.
Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you. The interesting thing about that is that when you end up doing that, it's not entirely through your own choices that you ended up doing that. You were elbowed into doing that by the media and by pressures outside of yourself.
Yeah.
That are entirely conventional and do not have your best interest anywhere in them.
Exactly. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, they're totally antagonistic to your interests.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now,
regardless
Craig is
of which side you pick.
Regardless, of course, because that's the game. Craig is an interesting case in point because he's been brutally attacked by people who are just crazy.
Yeah.
And he's a very, very strong guy, mentally, physically. He's just a very strong guy, and he can withstand it. He can hold his head high and do his work in the midst of all of this. I don't know if I could do that. Craig's like a superhero,
Yeah. It seems a bit so.
Yeah. So the best that we could do is just stick to our guns and develop the kind of discipline that makes a person like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I really do feel that's true, where it's like, you can get caught up in all these external things that are happening, but like I sort of got to a point where I'm like, okay, am I going to be president myself one day? No. So then what am I doing here? Like, I am the president inside of my own head right now, and I need to clean up my party, was basically the sort of whatever, the comparison, I guess, where it's like,
when I was a little kid, like even in the late 60s or 70s, as a little kid, when I would do something really bad, and that's why, I got where I got as a little kid, because I was really a bad kid, that they would, when I got arrested or something, they would all say, well, this is going on your permanent record. It's like, permanent record that I'm supposed to care about. What does that mean? I'm not going to become president now? And I digested by the time I was like 6 years old. Okay, you're not going to become president. You've got a permanent record. So at that point, I'm like, woohoo, fuck the permanent record. I just threw that in because I thought it was funny, but
yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah, knowing that my permanent record was preventing me from delving too deep in their world, which I never had any interest in anyway. Now, even as a little kid, I knew you can't get along in their world. Even if you wanted to, you're not going to be able to.
Yeah.
Right. That was great.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, I took it in a very bad direction for, a number of years by becoming like a drug addict and an asshole, and excusing it as doing whatever I wanted. But ultimately, when I got clean and got serious about my life, that came back. That attitude came back of, I could do anything I want. I don't have to answer to anyone ever.
Yeah. Yeah. So, all right. Well, I guess so to take this off in a different direction then.
Whatever you want.
So like we kind of already were talking about this earlier, but I don't think we were recording. So, this is darkness is my site, and sort of I think that name maybe is what led you to me even more than myself. And so like I would like to just sort of converse a little bit on the topic of darkness, wherever it leads us. Um, and you know, if maybe you can just give your definition of it or inability to give a definition of it, or what is darkness to you?
Okay. What I'm going to try to say what I'm going to say without using any technical Kabbalistic language at all, right? Because I don't know whether you know it or you don't know it. It doesn't matter, right? I'll say it in ordinary vernacular. Up until the point where there is a huge shift in the way that mind functions for an individual person, darkness and light are opposites. They're contrasts, and they complement each other by their absence from each other. Like the degree to which something seems bright is the degree to which it's not dark, and the degree to which it's dark is the degree to which it's not bright. So you have an exchange of contrasts in the ordinary sense for the minds of people, and the definition is a polar binary definition. Okay. There is a point that one heads for and becomes aware of in mystical practice, which is said to be like a door that opens and closes. If the door is closed, you are basically locked into this dualistic framework, and what is bright and what is dark are defined by each other in reverse, in their opposite, right? And it's a matter of degree, and it's a matter of exchange and oscillation, binary oscillation. But if that door is ever opened and the stream of inquiry or awareness passes through that door, what happens is the door erases these assumptions that have designated these dualistic meanings for what is light and dark. And what is discovered is a commonality between them, which renders them no longer opposites from each other, right? And at that point, there is a brightness within what would be conventionally considered dark that is so intense that it can't even be seen, and vice versa. In approaching darkness, there's a brilliance of intensity, which is absolutely full of the same kind of shining, radiant capacity for illumination as what you thought bright was before. So the idea of contrasts and opposites and dualistic extremes, once that is realized to be just a conceptual set of designations, something that the mind has accepted by habit, because you didn't choose that. That's just the default setting of your habits and the habits of the realm. When it's challenged by degree, challenge after challenge after challenge, ultimately you pass beyond the defining guidelines of the realm, of the human realm, of conceptual fixation on designated points that say this is this and that is that. And if you continue in that form of inquiry past the point of reason and logic and the definitions of what we think things are or are not, there is a form of darkness which is absolutely bright and a form of brightness that is absolutely dark, and they answer to a basic non-dual commonality, which is the secret essential ingredient inherent in all phenomena. It is in awareness that knows, and it's in all the things that we think are known. It's inherent. It is what, if we took a left turn and went down a few streets, what the religious people would call God. There's certain profound differences, because in religious systems, they're usually based on causality. God becomes the first cause. God creates a universe and all the creations interact and blah, blah, blah. Where I'm talking about going, there is no causality. There is no first cause. There's just the spontaneous expression of profound essentiality that doesn't die and was never born, right? It's bornless and deathless. There is no creation in the direction that I'm talking about. So to use terms that have to do with causation, causality, where something is created or is derived from something else, that's not where I'm going with this. Where I'm going with this is an innate birthless and deathless essentiality that is beyond solutions like Big Bang. Creation of the universe. Well, what about what preceded that? Oh, you don't have an answer, huh? So everything you're going to tell me from that point forward is only going to be contained within the subset of what you think started at a certain point. Started at a certain point. You're telling me infinity started at a certain point?
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. So the absurdity of that completely undermines any faith in the arguments that they're going to give you.
Yeah.
It's like, from that point on, I don't care what you have to say. You think the universe started at a certain point. Fuck you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that goes to what you said I think it was in Fountain of Wisdom, where it's like, how can God have made everything? Like, what made God? It's the same argument. And that, that's where it says, well, there can't be a God. There's just all of these different things that we're experiencing or not experiencing that are happening or not happening anywhere in this vast expanse. And as you were talking there, I'm thinking of different examples of things that I could pinpoint, and it is just so hard to pinpoint. And the thing to me that seems the most possible to try to capture these concepts is space itself, where, like, a sun floating through the darkness, or the moon being dark or light, depending on something shining off of it. But again, that still all ends up having a cause and an effect to it that sort of still ends up going outside of the realms of what you're saying.
Yes, that's right. That's why I think that door that I mentioned that opens and closes, where consideration beyond dualistic contrasts it can become possible, that door consists of not knowing something that you don't already know. It consists of unknowing, entering into the process of unknowing and allowing the unknowable to gently sparkle through the knowingness that is used for knowing this or that thing. The answer to what I'm talking about is not in new information. You are not going to get any new information that is going to answer this question or change the way that you are. What's going to change it is utterly blowing apart the addiction to knowing this or that, or this over that, comparing and contrasting different pieces of information, which comprises a conceptual substructure to a world that doesn't quite work. Right? Going beyond that requires unknowing all of that, as well as the means in which that rooted itself in you to begin with.
Yeah.
And once unknowing takes over, and once you fall in love with that unknowing, because that unknowing is darkly bright and brilliantly dark, then the darkness that you're talking about is synonymous with the love. The love pours itself into that darkness, that bright darkness, and the bright darkness pours itself back as more love.
Yeah.
That's mysticism.
Yeah. And, I think I'd be interested to see what you have to say on this, where dark ambient falls into this sort of whole thing, because there's been times when I'm listening to dark ambient with people where they're like, well, this doesn't sound very dark. And it's like, oh, it is. And it's like, well, or it's not, you know, and that when something becomes something that you love or something that is absolutely beautiful within the context of a dark ambient music, I feel like that might be a decent point, a decent place to look to sort of feel this thing happening in some sense of reality, maybe where
Yeah. What you're talking about is aesthetics. How does the role of aesthetics play in? It's a really, really good way to continue this conversation. Dark ambient or ambient music in general, to me, is religious music. It's devotional music. Like, for example, I don't know whether you like Tim Hecker at all.
yeah,
Yeah. Have you ever heard Ravedeath 1972 album?
I think I did once. I'm not really familiar with it though.
Well, I'm just using that arbitrarily because it popped
Sure.
into my mind. But when I hear ambient music, which is, it's not random sensation, it seems to be glorifying something intangible that exists in fields or beds of activity, right? That
Yeah.
are transrational or outside of rational structures, like a song structure, or having some cohesive thing. When I compare the really, really good pieces of dark ambient music with other forms of devotional musical expression, like Bach's Mass in B minor, it's a
Yeah.
really good example. When I listen to the Mass in B minor by J.S. Bach, that is the supreme Western classical presentation of devotional music. A glory to God, boom, here's the whole heavens are opening up and the little fat boys are flying around blowing trumpets and so on and so forth, right? I don't see a whole lot of difference in intentionality between that and the Tim Hecker album, right? It seems like he wants to go to that place of sublime unknowing just as much as Bach does.
Yeah. Yeah. And to me, I think it gets a lot closer. On just this is a personal feeling to me where it's like there's so much chaos that happens within classical music just in the need to have all these different instruments and all these different notes, and you're trying to fit it within a structure, you're trying to impress people's certain classical sensibilities. It goes to what we were talking about earlier, where it's the difference of a recluse sitting in their room reading a book, and they can go whichever direction they want to it with it, compared to somebody that's like, I'm doing this because this is my career and I need to get this much out of this so I can write this about it. And it just feels like dark ambient is allowed to build that expression in whichever way it's necessary to be built, whereas classical, they are forced to stick within their framework.
Well, there's both good, bad, and mediocre examples of this. You have to take it on a case by case basis. And I think the rare times when any aesthetic expression achieves what we're talking about is rare, is rare in any form. But with music, you have two different sides to the continuum. You have composition, where something is planned out to be a certain way, and you have improvisation, where whatever happens can be utilized and you have a series of moves that are possible to be made, and it can go anywhere in any direction.
Yeah.
So what happens with a lot of ambient music is, in a sense, hinting at a third thing, which is not just focused on the improvised aspects and certainly not focused on the composed aspects. It seems to be the assertion of atmospheres.
Yeah.
That are intangibles, intangible fields that could be very much composed or improvised, but we wouldn't even know that.
Yeah.
Well,
I think that's another element of what I meant that I wasn't explaining very well, where it really feels like it's very much all about the atmosphere with dark ambient, and that leaves you a place inside of your own mind to get into contemplation that is less distracted by external factors. You can crank the dark ambient up, just blasting, shaking the whole room, and yet you have all of the room in your head necessary to contemplate an idea and read a book, even as everything around you is vibrating with dark ambient music. It's still almost like it's not there.
Get a subwoofer.
Trust me.
So can you name a few things that you think function that way? And I'm curious if I know them or not.
Well, okay, so I've been listening to a lot of Rajon Detre while I've been reading your book. His new album, Damaniacum, is a really nice example, I think.
That one I don't know.
Atrium Carcery, I think, touches on this along with on the Onyx album, along with Kammerheit. I'm good friends with Per of Kammerheit, and I really think that his music can touch on these things in this way. Desideri Marginus, I think, touches on it a good bit.
See, the problem is that the way that you would become exposed to things that are hard to find is so compartmentalized now.
Yeah.
That I don't know one of the artists that you're talking about.
Well, see, that's the thing. We both know what we're talking about. We both are talking about the same thing, and yet your examples and my examples don't overlap almost at all.
Right. Because and also the media is probably different because, you know, I mostly play records and buy physical CDs, you know, and maybe these things aren't even available like that.
No, I have a lot of the stuff I do listen to on record, actually.
So that, well, yeah, well, vinyl is coming back. That's true.
Yes.
They are pressing things like crazy. Well, I wrote this piece in Zorn's book, Arcana Volume 5, where I talked about how you could take a drone, right, a drone piece or ambient piece of music and dissolve into it, so that the sensation of listening merged with the vibratory field and you could forget about the body line barrier and forget, utterly lose yourself in the act to join with the space that was vibrating. Because essentially, when you have a vibratory field of sound, there's nothing there. There's no physical substance. So it's this perfect metaphor and opportunity for dissolving into the nothingness, dissolving into the unknowing, which still presents itself as something that can be known. So you have that paradox, right? That's because you always have that paradox. There is no nothingness. You will never find a nothing.
Yeah.
It's impossible. You will only find what purports to be a something, and maybe can realize something about the something that is not something.
Yeah.
That's the challenge. It is that paradox. It's, you know, some people say that it's like a razor's edge. It's not even a razor's edge, because on a razor's edge, you have two sides, right? The something and the nothing. What I'm saying is there is no difference whatsoever.
Yeah. I think, you know, like things like Tibetan Buddhism, for instance, or just generally things that come out of the region of India have for a long time been trying to put their finger on this concept. And I think it's telling that things like the chanting that the Tibetan monks that do their chants, or the singing bowls, there's an element of drone to both, especially to a singing bowl when you're just, you know, rolling the wood around the edge of the bowl. That is a drone. That has been used in a religious perspective for a long time by them.
Yeah, in Indian music, the drone is the basis of the whole thing, because a raga is basically, you know, you talk about rock as being simplistically 3 chords. Ragas are 1 chord.
Yeah.
You know, and the whole idea of the context for raga improvisation is the drone of the tambura.
Yeah.
Right. The constant drone of the tambura. I was so infatuated with this that I actually bought a tambura years ago, and you could learn to play it very easily, but to be good at it is, of course, not easy.
Yeah.
But I could make the sound, you know, it's all the jawari, the place where the strings touch. The jawari is the place that makes the vibration noise. and you just learn to keep it going. And that's when I started to think about drones. I knew that I wasn't a musician, so I stopped playing the tambura, but basically was just in totally infatuated with this thing that we're talking about, dissolving into a sonic field.
Yeah.
Where the dualistic extremes like light and dark can be unmade. That seems to be the whole point. And once that point is made poignantly in your mind, you apprehend it everywhere, right? So that's why I consider dark ambient music to be devotional music, right?
Yeah.
Spiritual religious music, as much as, like I think of true devotional music that I love in the classical tradition, in the jazz tradition. Like in the jazz tradition, for example, A Love Supreme by John Coltrane. That's devotional music.
Yeah.
Right. Those 4 sections of that album express the love of the ineffable on a scale that you can't even calculate. I mean, you are invited into this space of loving the infinite, so much so that if you love it along with the instrumentation, you sink forever. There's no end. There's no end to the level of appreciation and the depth to which you fall through that opening that they've given you.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what the whole aesthetic experience seems to be about. I mean, at least for me, it's the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bathe in that ocean and lose yourself. The analogy is that you're a doll made of salt that is thrown into the sea, and the salt slowly melts and the doll slowly dissolves into the salt water.
Yeah,
right?
That's interesting.
Yeah. And that becomes, that is what the aesthetic opportunity, that's all that it is, as far as I'm concerned. So, like I always say that I'm not interested in anything other than my practice, but to me, music is part of my practice.
Yeah, definitely. Whoa, the sun just lit my room
I
up.
don't view listening to a record as some kind of separate activity in my life from doing my practice. I view it devotionally. Yeah.
And so, but does it depend to you on what the record is then?
Well, yeah, because there are varying degrees of success of the ability to provide an opportunity for total immersion.
Like, my point is, you wouldn't just be able to find something and say, oh, I like this can be part of it. There needs to be specific elements that are fitting into what you were looking for in order for it to fit that requirement, or no? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think at that point you're talking about varying degrees of profundity or varying degrees of success with the form.
Yeah.
For example, I listened to a lot of pre-war recordings, mostly American, on 78s, and most of them from the southeast of the United States, whether you're talking about like blues or ragtime or early jazz or that kind of thing, before amplified instruments were added. I listened to a lot of stuff like that. And it's not all devotional music. Like Cannon's Jug Stompers is not really devotional music, for example. But I love it because it's pure joy, So maybe in the joy of it, I turn it into a devotional experience by virtue of how I'm listening to it.
Yeah.
So it's not the intention of Gus Cannon to immerse mystically in En Sof. Gus Cannon is a drunk guy with a banjo and a jug. And he is most definitely drunk, and his concerns have
nothing to do with the profound.
Definitely not. Even in country music, which I like very much, I don't think in the mid 70s, George Jones was thinking about the divine.
Yeah.
Or if he was, it was probably early one Sunday morning after he was incredibly drunk on Saturday night.
Yeah.
And, but yet there's a nuance that happens almost in spite of the form that is transcendent, absolutely transcendent. Why? Because there's this blazing talent that can do something with the human voice that is like insanely unheard of.
Yeah.
You know, Hank Williams, same thing. He could have been the biggest asshole on earth, having the most debased life on earth, but for some reason, what landed in his heart, what landed in him was this transcendent ability to play with sound.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Um, I don't know what you'll think about this, but I have been finding that with Charles Manson's music a lot lately.
I know those records pretty well.
Yeah.
I had them when they were all bootlegs in the 70s that you'd get in bizarre places. Yeah, I think I've heard like every single one of them. And, you know, his songs, some of his songs were actually interesting songs. And
Very badly recorded, but the actual music itself.
yeah, there were the recordings that were recorded on the equipment that he stole from a van or something. And then there's a bunch of songs which were just recorded by the girls and Bobby Boiselet, I think his name was.
Yeah.
And he wasn't even on them. And that was a bunch of them. And then there's the sort of Beach Boys period where he was, you know, hanging out at Dennis Wilson's house and trying to.
Well, the stuff that I particularly like and am thinking is the most profound happened while he was at Vacaville Mental Hospital in the early 1980s, specifically.
Oh,
It was just him sitting there with his guitar with a recorder playing, and he just recorded it onto tapes and got it smuggled out of the prison. And some of those tapes are incredible. Um, the things that he does with his voice and his guitar, it really is strange how it feels like there's just so much more happening than just a man sitting there playing guitar and singing. And it's not related to his voice or his specific talent with the guitar so much as it just really felt like he was trying to get a message across that worked. I don't know.
I I have spent a lot of time in my youth with books and other forms of media that portrayed his message and his philosophy. Thought a great deal about it. He was associated with a couple of groups that I know various things about. One was the Solar Lodge of the OTO. The other was the Straight Satan Motorcycle Club. And you hang around, you talk to people, you find out these various things. And I thought a lot about it. He definitely had some elements which were interesting to consider, but far and away beyond any of them, the thing that interested me the most was his status as an outsider.
Yeah.
And how being outside of the outside caused him to question even being part of the realm, the human realm.
Mm-hmm.
And, this is the inevitable consequence of living like that, that if you have a halfway decent brain and you are forced to live outside society, either you become a, a pile of garbage and a waste of time, or you start to think of alternatives to the status quo as a way to allow your life to be pursued. And he came up with a series of solutions as an outsider, which made you think about the question of meaning in a life. He was involved with that question. Whether I agree with his conclusions or not are beside the point.
Yeah, that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, and in his best examples of the music that I've heard, you hear evidence of that to some degree. It doesn't mean it's great music, but it definitely contains a visionary level of opting out from the status quo, which is interesting.
I just kind of wanted you to riff on that for a minute, so thank you, because it's he's one of those topics that it's just, you could very easily say, oh, his music sucks or he's crazy, but I think there's a bit more to it than that. So I like to hear, like, you know, different guys like you and Craig and some of these different musicians, just to like see what they have to say on the topic, whether they're like, oh, I hate that guy, that's okay, you know, or if you're like, oh, there's something interesting about it. Like, don't get me wrong, a lot of his like things that he was fighting for and liked, I'm totally against a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
However, as a person, as a spiritual person, I find him to be very interesting.
Yeah, like I said, I just gave you the best case scenario of the best thing that I could say about him. But in terms of the music, a lot of it does suck.
Yeah, a lot of it does.
Right. So then there's that.
Yeah.
So outside of the stuff that I just wouldn't want to listen to because it doesn't sound interesting to me, that quality that I'm talking about is probably spread over a lot of things and doesn't get distilled into any one song or piece in a way that I could say, well, that one does it. I think the quality that I'm talking about, I hear it little bits here and there. It's elusive. Yeah, very much so.
And sometimes eludes entire songs and albums.
But there are a lot of people who have similar qualities like that. The only reason why we would be focused on him is because he was a celebrity.
Yeah. True.
And within absolutely no question, he was a celebrity.
Yeah.
That's how you have to look at him. He was created by the media, and he created himself along with that.
Yeah.
Now, definitely. What he did in the mid to late 60s to prepare himself for that, a lot of guys fell out of prison and were, you know, scamming a bunch of girls and came up with, you know, crazy guru solutions. That was by no means unique.
Yeah.
Like, you walk down any street in LA or San Francisco, you're going to find somebody doing that in the late 60s.
Yeah.
You know, to varying degrees.
Yeah. And, you know, that's what I've read like different biographies by people involved, and that's what they said. Like, you can't throw a rock without hitting a guru, and whatever reason we ended up with him, you know,
right.
It's just like sheer luck or unluck.
Well, it was a period that was so replete with interesting outsider stuff going on that, in a way, I'm very glad that I am not this age at that time historically, because I would be so distracted by participating in all these things that were going on that I probably wouldn't do any work.
Yeah.
Part of what I like about this historical period is the fact that it sucks.
Yeah, we have a lot of time to spend in our own world because there's not much going on outside of it.
No, it's a total write-off.
Yeah.
So thankfully it's a total write-off. So I could sit here in this room or that room and do my work and not feel like I'm missing out on anything.
Yeah. So I just grabbed your CD off of the shelf here, which
the Dream Membrane.
This thing is really beautiful.
Well, that label, Sodic Records, they do a great job. Those are all my drawings, but the graphics of the label, there's one graphic designer that does all the packaging for that label, and her name is Hong Hong. I know her quite well. That's John Zorn's label.
Yeah, but yeah, let me just hold that up closer.
Yep,
Yeah,
there you go.
Is so beautiful. This is for people that are unfamiliar with the album. I was unaware of it until I had interviewed Gabriel McCaffrey of Anathema Publishing, and after our interview, he sent me over a list of all of his favorite dark ambient albums, and this was on the list, and that was my first. That was my first introduction to it. I was like, oh, this is interesting, and somehow you've managed to keep it off of the internet. Kudos to you.
No. That's all on Zorn. Zorn, it just hates people ripping off his music. He's a really good businessman, really shrewd guy, and he's like all over that. I was like really surprised that it didn't find it on Bandcamp or YouTube or you know, as like an official version or as somebody ripping it, which, you know, would have been a worse option. But there's only one that you could get, and it's from Russia, and it's in Russian, It's
Oh
not
yeah.
on YouTube. It's not on any of those things. And I wish it was, because I just want people to hear it, because I don't expect to make any money from it, obviously.
Yeah, well, I mean, after having heard it, it's really, really. I think the thing is maybe at this point, after it's been out for a little while, it might be nice for that to happen. But I think it's in its initial stages, and really for the purpose of me talking about it, it's better that it's only in physical form right now because it's absolutely gorgeous. And
Well, it's interesting that you bring this up, because recently, like within the past week or two, John and Bill Laswell did another CD together, and they asked me if I wanted to be on it, and I really can't at this point. So I said no, but I did the cover and the artwork for it.
nice,
And it's not really a part two of that, because I'm not on it.
because you're not on it.
But it has my artwork. And plus, I'm past the point where I think that I want to just do a spoken word recitation over music. I'm not so sure that would work every time. At a certain point, that would get really tiresome to hear somebody talking.
Yeah, well, I do understand what you mean. I think that it's amazing to have it with you talking on it. Um, a couple, like from my perspective, just a couple of different things that I think would be cool is maybe a version with the spoken word and a version without the spoken word.
Oh, well, that's
And
all on Bill.
all
That's all on
and
how he mixed it.
well, I'm just saying,
Yeah.
at any point in the future for anything else that you might want to do, but when just your graphics are amazing. So to have those involved in their project, I'm sure is increasing the aesthetic value of that project. And also, if you are involved like through a graphics perspective, but also through, you don't necessarily have to make the music, but if you are sort of giving them the inspiration for the songs, like, something like that, just having like some sort of a backbone to the spark of interest that makes the whole thing happen. I think that could be another interesting way to sort of bring yourself into a project without necessarily speaking on the project. Not
There
to
is
say that
one.
you should do anything that I'm saying, but just, some ideas.
No, there is one, actually. A guy named Nathaniel Ritter, who's an ambient composer, I think he lives in Minnesota, has done a series of pieces based on drawings and diagrams of mine.
Awesome.
And he functions under the name Circulation of Light.
Cool. Yeah,
And if you look up Circulation of Light, like on Bandcamp, you will see versions like that actually have my voice in them as well.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. So I have tried that with him. We haven't worked on it for a while. It's mostly his project.
Yeah.
And he's an exceptionally talented guy with a lot of great impulses. So I hope to be doing some more of that soon. And I did, what else did I do? I have tried this a few times with a few different people. Zorn and Laswell was an obvious one because they have such a big audience.
Yeah.
That so many people love them. And Zorn just keeps going forever. He puts out, it seems like an album a week.
Yeah. Yeah, some people can do that really well. For some artists it all just falls into the ether, and for other artists, like, it just feels like every single one of those albums ends up having some level of profundity to it, where it's like they just keep having a new spark of creativity every time, and just, I have to sit down and do this.
Well, the thing about Zorn is the focal point of a scene, and many musicians depend upon him for their living so that they can work, so they could do concerts, back when there used to be such a thing, or
Seriously.
albums. And really, he runs it. He's a band leader. He's like in a sense, like a Count Basie or Duke Ellington type figure, where it's band, and it's a big group of musicians. And it's been that way for a long time, since the 80s, that many people are in the Zorn circuit, you know, and
Yeah.
he really keeps them alive.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. Um, so is there anything that you would like to say specifically related to this album that you did with them?
Yes, there's the recitation that I'm doing is a chapter from a book that was published by Inner Traditions Press called The Awakening Ground. And this particular chapter was a departure from the rest of this book, where I just went into this crazy imagery. It was called The Pregnant Sacrificial Beast. And basically, I just started reading this chapter, but at a certain point, I started changing what I was reading as I was reading it, and just started talking like that. And I was out in the sound booth, and Laswell was in the control room in his studio, and I couldn't see anything because it was all dark. He turned off all the lights except the light that was shining on what I was reading from.
Yeah.
So I couldn't see anybody. And I was just reading from it, and I ended up just saying some very, very strange things, and he edited it together to be what it was. The edit and the way that it was mixed is all him. I had no part in that whatsoever.
Yeah.
He just put me in that booth and allowed me to read my work. And then Zorn came in and played his solos, and Laswell put the piece together. The actual structure of the ambient music is all Laswell. Zorn is like a guest soloist, and I'm essentially like a soloist or reader.
Yeah.
And we were mixed in as elements to the bed of sound that Laswell produced with a series of drones in his gigantic studio in West Orange, New Jersey, that we went out and did in one day. And then,
yeah, that's awesome.
And then it appeared. And the thing about it is that I was so in love with Laswell's previous CDs that were collaborative efforts with Tetsu Inoue and Mick Harris, and the one he did with Buckethead, and the it's really that one Cymatic Scan that he did with Mick Harris, which, oh no, that was Tetsu Inoue, that one. Cymatic Scan is the name of it. That's probably my favorite of the group. If you could ever find that CD, that's
I'm gonna have to search that out.
Oh, that's an incredible piece. Cymatic Scan. It was put out, I think, mid 90s, late 90s, something like that. Yeah. Quite a while ago. And it's just absolutely beautiful. And it states the premise of dark ambient music as a summary better than almost anything that I could think of. It like typifies the genre.
Nice.
And the other thing that I love about it is that it's fresh. It was in the beginning enough of the genre that it didn't have what became sort of cliches. Mm-hmm. It was very shocking, actually, to hear somebody making an entire CD like this.
Yeah, I could only imagine that. I can see how it's so different now, where this whole thing, these words have been trodden on so many times already, where,
right,
back in the 80s, where it's like, wait, what are they doing? Like, when's the band start playing? The band isn't gonna start playing. Just enjoy what you're hearing.
Well,
and like the I mean, people that haven't heard ambient music really, but to some extent, at least new age sort of stuff falls into people's periphery one way or another, where they aren't really surprised by it anymore.
Right, but the problem with new age music is that it was always terrible.
Exactly. Yeah, there's just no. You'd think they'd be putting some level of something behind it, but it really just seems very vacuous.
Yeah, the 1976 or 1977 Brian Eno album On Land, to me, still remains probably the greatest piece of ambient music ever. You know, I love that record so deeply and listen to it so frequently because of the variety of sensations and the variety of sounds
Yeah.
that seem to be, each one is a surprise. You know, each new bed of sound is a surprise because he was doing something that no one ever heard before, right?
Yeah.
And then what I read, and I'm not even sure where I read this, it could have even been the liner notes to the record, but what Eno said was that he got the idea from one of the sides of Miles Davis's album He Loved Him Madly, which was basically a piece of ambient music that Miles did in the studio and mixed. I mean, the musicians didn't play it the way that he mixed it. He created this sonic landscape, which was a completely etheric ocean of slow moving tides of fields against each other.
I love Miles Davis, so I'm gonna have to check this out.
Oh yeah, the album He Loved Him Madly is one of the albums from the mid 70s. I think it's from 74, and it's from right before he stopped, before he disappeared from the music scene. Could have been 73.
Yeah, I'm taking note of that. I'm definitely gonna have to give that a listen.
Well, it's a double album, and the side that Eno is talking about, I think, is the title track, He Loved Him Madly. From, oh, no. The album title is Get Up With It.
Get Up With It, okay.
Yeah. The piece is He Loved Him Madly.
Nice. Yeah, I'm gonna give that a try.
Yeah, you probably found it in 2 seconds.
Well, I'm not searching it up yet. I'm just taking notes here.
Yeah. The album is called Get Up With It, and the piece is called He Loved Him Madly, and it's a side of a record. It's a 20-minute piece of essentially ambient atmospheres. Awesome. And it's just sublime. And I do believe that that was the inspiration for Eno's On Land record.
That's really cool. That's really interesting to know that.
That could be I think On Land, or certainly, you know, it came out of Eno's records like Music for Airports. I think On Land could be the first official ambient record. I don't know if that's true or not.
Yeah, I'm not really sure either. I soon after I discovered dark ambient, I almost immediately started writing about it because I was so damned annoyed that I had not found the genre before I did, that my first thought was I need to spread the word immediately. So soon after 2013, 2014, I started to get into it. And by 2015, I was already writing about new albums. So it's been hard for me to work my way backward because I'm always trying to stay on top of the new things that are happening. That I've always got a list of 15 new albums that I need to absorb, and I never have time to sit there and say, okay, I'm going to go back to the 70s and see what was happening back then. It's just something that I keep saying I'm going to do, and it just keeps not happening.
Well, On Land record is certainly an exception, that if you want to pick one, I would go directly for that.
Yeah, I should do that.
If you want to see a lot of the predecessors of this direction, you're going to find them in the classical tradition of minimalist composers from the mid-century point of around 1950 on till the end of the 20th century. And certainly by late 20th century, you had minimalist composers of a variety of different types doing a series of things that were on various levels of patterning. Because the question within minimalism is whether the pattern or rhythmic element was dominant, or whether the fields and the drone was dominant. So you had total drone composers like Phil Niblock and Alvin Lucier, and a Scandinavian composer named Folk Rob, who's very interesting, as well as electroacoustic composers who made drones. And the electroacoustic school throughout the 20th century, going back before the mid-century point, to musique concrète with composers like Pierre Henry. And who's another example? Pierre Henry is the one that comes to mind the most. Richard Maxwell or Maxfield or something like that, an American, but Pierre Henry certainly predates that, going back to the, I guess, 1940s, many of which of those electroacoustic pieces are quite ambient. It's tape music.
Oh, nice.
I had a studio back when I was an artist directly over the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center in Harlem. And the vent system for the building that brought heat into my studio,
oh goodness,
connected me with the vent of the studio where they were making the electronic music. So I heard electronic music coming through my vent
oh man,
all day, depending on who was down there working. And this was in the early 80s or mid 80s, I should say. And at that point, I don't even know if it exists anymore, because now it's all digital. And the purpose of that electronic music studio was essentially tape, manipulation of tape. So all of the original electroacoustic stuff, or most of it anyway, was on tape. Some of it, like Morton Subotnick, was computer, what they just used to call computer music.
Yeah.
And I think, you get really popular records like Morton Subotnick, Silver Apples of the Moon was the first big one. But amongst the minimalists who are interesting as composers, predating what we call ambient music, you get figures like Terry Riley, who's one of my favorite musical figures of all time. Some of the most beautiful, improvised, minimalist fields of sound. You get albums like Terry Riley's Descending Moonshine Dervishes, or Shri Camel, or any of those from the early 70s. Just absolutely sublimely beautiful things. That's devotional music.
That's really cool. You're giving me a lot of interesting things that I'm going to be looking into after our conversation here.
Yeah, if you could pick out of everything I said, 4 different records. You got Eno's On Land, you got Terry Riley's Descending Moonshine Dervishes, you got Miles Davis, Get Up With It with He Loved Him Madly on it. And what's another one I could throw in? Oh yeah, Bill Laswell, Cymatic Scan.
Nice.
You just get those 4. And I guarantee you're gonna go crazy over them, because there's nothing better than that.
That's really awesome.
So
I'm glad you have such an interesting history on, like, you have such a thorough understanding of the history of all this stuff. I haven't really spoken with anybody before that I think has nearly the sort of background knowledge and has explained it like you are doing right now. So that's pretty awesome.
Well, it comes from my entire life, from the time that I was
experienced it.
Hey, when I was a mixed up, drug addicted kid, all I did is sit in a room and listen to records.
Yeah.
And I just never stopped.
Yeah.
So I've spent literally my entire life sitting in a room listening to records.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's my life in a lot of ways. Just enjoying music, and I like almost all music. Like, really, there's very few, as far as genres go, there's really no genres that I don't like. I don't like a lot of country, but that's pretty much where it ends, of me like having a limit on things. But yeah, these are a lot of really interesting albums to check out, and I think people are going to appreciate hearing that history quite a bit.
Well, country is a case in point for a very misleading set of classifications, because
Agreed.
The stuff that is just god awful commercial crap,
which is what I hate.
Simple-minded stuff that is designed for people who are not that bright. Yeah. There's so much of that. But then again, you get like Bill Monroe or Hank Williams from the late 40s.
Yeah.
And it's sublimely authentic.
See,
and beautiful.
I grew up hating Garth Brooks. But
yeah.
I love, like Johnny Cash, or, the different guys that you're saying. Like, when it goes back to like anything from like the 70s and earlier, I like a lot of it. But anything that I had heard when I was developing my, okay, I like this, I like that, I don't like this, I don't like that, country was definitely in the dislike category because everything happening with country in the 90s was just, ugh.
Yeah, and you grew up in Maryland, did you say?
Yeah,
All right, so you're pretty close to the Mason-Dixon line. You're getting like the flip side, the bad side of that. You have to tolerate a bunch of nonsense, probably.
yes,
But then again, you know, when you go back to that early period, you know, you get like I mentioned Bill Monroe and Hank Williams, but you know, there is sublimely beautiful stuff. Who else could I throw in? The Stanley Brothers, for sure. Carter family. You know, this is music before the electric period.
yeah. Well, my grandfather used to play country when he was like in his 20s, and as he would say, it didn't used to be called country back then. It was just music.
Right. The dividing line, I think, is when drums were added.
Yeah.
You know, like once you have drums, which come from somewhere else, right? You have a different thing.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Things have changed so much since then.
Yeah,
And
the whole notion of having drums and how drums are mixed in music tells the story of a certain side of American culture, because it seems at a certain point, once the drums were added, they progressively became mixed louder and louder in recordings.
yeah.
Till the point where the entire emphasis of the song was a drum emphasis.
Yeah, well, and as we're saying this, like I would say I like things like Americana and folk genres. And those in a lot of ways are like country without the drums. Or sometimes there's drums, but in a lot of things that happen in those two genres, there aren't drums. And that's what I think that might be a dividing factor for
Yeah,
me.
like bluegrass.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, the thing about it is that once you go pre-war with this, which is essentially non-electric instruments, only acoustic instruments, you get this dichotomy in American culture between white and black culture.
Yeah.
And I like them both. You
Yeah.
know, pre-war recordings of the black culture from that period in what they would call the Jim Crow or post Jim Crow South is like was made for the audiences within those communities and nobody else. Those recordings weren't sold outside of those communities. They were made by people in the communities for those communities. The same with the white communities.
Yeah.
But occasionally you get some adventurous guy in the 20s who heard a Charlie Patton record and said, what the hell is this? You know, and adapted influences. And that's how you get a Johnny Cash or an Elvis Presley.
That's what I was just about to say. That was the thing that put Elvis on the map. And to a certain extent, probably the Beatles also.
Well, the Beatles heard records that came from sailors in Liverpool. You know, sailors brought records. Records were the thing, you know, like individual records. Like you were a sailor and you bought a record, you'd bring it home.
Yeah.
You know, you're in a like seaport town like Liverpool in the 50s. To have an obscure record was like a hugely rare thing. People couldn't believe it that you would have, you know, some obscure blues record, like have a Howlin' Wolf record in Liverpool in the 50s. You were the god on your street if you had that.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm a huge blues fan. And so I'm mentioning these names because that's what would have driven me crazy if I heard it back then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I think a lot of people nowadays aren't really, I know I haven't looked back on so many of the interesting things that have happened musically throughout history. And even with the internet at our fingertips, you have to know where to search. It's like you're saying, with like things get so compartmentalized that the whole world is at your fingertips, but if you don't know what to type into Google, you're still just as lost as you would have been 30 years ago without an internet.
Yeah, right. The
Um,
impulses are the same, even though the technologies are completely different, that essentially people do what they're habituated to doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, that's the thing that was my initial reason for branching out with This Is Darkness, because I wanted it to be about dark ambient, but I also wanted people to look for other things and then find dark ambient by accident, as I did, because if you don't know to search for it, you don't know it's there. And I've been listening to dark music since the early 90s and didn't know anything about dark ambient until 2013. So I just felt that was a crime that needed to be remedied. So I've been dedicating myself to remedying that problem as much as I can.
Yeah. Yeah. When I was a teenager, before there was a category called ambient music, before Eno's album came out and pointed towards it, I always searched out for sonic fields or drones, or even patterned fields that functioned like drones in records, because I had a desire for that or a hunger for that.
Nice.
So I heard things that had that element in them, in classical music, like, for example, electroacoustic music, like Pierre Henry. When I listened to Pierre Henry as a teenager, it was for those passages. It wasn't for the wildly tempestuous uproar of the record. It was in the quiet drone passages that became ominous and intense in their ominous qualities, that could even increase in volume and not break the atmosphere. I would look for that, try to seek it out. And once it became a genre, I thought, well, what a relief. This thing that I've been interested in is now on the map.
Yeah, I could imagine.
Because I always knew that it was there, and I talked about it. Most people didn't know what the hell I was referring to. Mm-hmm. But it was wildly important to me to find musical passages, sonic fields like this growing up, and then once I heard things like Eno, and then there was a category, I just went crazy trying to buy it.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. And, when I was growing up, if you were a kid like me, the record store was like your cathedral, where you could find anything. Like the really good record stores in New York City were temples. You'd go in there with a sense of reverence, and spend every penny that you didn't spend on drugs, you'd spend on records.
Yeah, I caught the tail end of that. I'm 38, and it was like, I got just a little taste of what that was like before the whole record store industry just totally fell apart when I was in my 20s, By then it's just no CDs, for me, first it was like tapes and then CDs, and then just the whole bottom fell out of it. Now you can't find a record store to save your life of any variety. Really.
Well, what you have now is very expensive boutique specialty stores.
Yeah.
And that to me kills the whole thing.
Yeah.
Like for example, heavy gram weight vinyl. Mm-hmm. What's the point of that? Does it really sound any better? It costs this X amount of money. They have this heavier pressing, where the whole physics of the whole thing, it just doesn't make any sense physics wise why that would sound any better. So they charge more for it. And now it's like a boutique specialty item and rarefied thing. Once you make something rarefied, there's something that happens in the mentality surrounding it that you kill off. I mean, once it's fresh and new and you don't even know what it is, and everybody is either enjoying it or not enjoying it, there's a certain open-ended freedom to it. But once you rarefy it as the end of some hyper-specific search, and you create this little precious object out of it, you absolutely kill it.
Yeah.
By doing that behavior. That behavior is so destructive to aesthetics, because at that point you're hyper commodifying it.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. And I did that even growing up, because I would search out rare records and act like that. And I would find that the actual enjoyment was affected by the collector mentality, because I'd be afraid to play the record,
Yeah.
you know.
That element wasn't necessarily there with the CDs for me. I think like the thing that, the thing that's there was such a looking at what it looked like and then taking it home and not necessarily knowing whether you were going to like it or not to a certain extent. And then I think people had a lot more, you tried harder to enjoy things that were outside of your field of interest. If an album went off into a direction that you weren't necessarily expecting, you would say, okay, well, maybe let me sit with this for a little while. Whereas now it's like, oh, I don't like that. Switch it to the next one, And
Oh yeah,
it's
there's
hard to give
the disposable mentality.
yeah, and that just it then it's hard to give innovation a try, and things just spiral deeper and deeper into pop music then, where you have to do the thing that makes people not skip the track. If they skip it, you're done.
Well, what happened was that once CDs came out, and it was pretty obvious that records were disappearing, I tried to buy multiple copies of everything that I liked to last me the rest of my life. Because I figured, okay, records are going to go away. I'll never see them again. Since I can get them now, I might as well stock up. So I have like 5 copies of so many records that I held in such esteem that every time I saw it, I would feel compelled to buy it. Even if it was the 6th copy, I had to buy it. So The Magic City by Sun Ra, or Live at the East by Pharoah Sanders. I have like this many of them. Or quite a few records like that. Terry Riley's and Other Descending Moonshine Dervishes, or La Voyage by Pierre Henry, the Tibetan Book of the Dead electroacoustic journey. Can't have enough copies of that. Sing Me a Song of Sangmai by Freddie Hubbard and Ilan Mimaroglu. Can't have enough of those.
Nice. Yeah.
That's another one you should look up, by the way.
Yeah, I will definitely.
Sing Me a Song of Sangmai by Ilan Mimaroglu, who's an electroacoustic composer, and Freddie Hubbard, who's a jazz trumpet player. That is one of the most disturbing records ever made.
Nice.
As a piece of music, it is literally a descent into wild psychosis and the horrors of the world.
Wow, that's pretty. Yeah, I always like when an album is described as horrifying. It's like, oh, that sounds like something I want to check out.
if you listen to that record with concentration, when you have time, in a room, dark room, from beginning to end, I guarantee you that it will make your Charles Manson records look like they came from Disneyland.
Nice. And I don't know if you're much of a fan of H.P. Lovecraft, but I always thought, like, with his story, the music of Eric Zahn, I always thought like Lovecraft would have really liked to hear what happened with music in the second half of that century, because he really seemed like he was trying to capture the idea of something like you're talking about, where it's just like this crazy droning horrifying sounds that yeah.
I don't know that much about Lovecraft, but I did live in Providence, Rhode Island for 4 years.
Oh, that's cool.
And I lived on Benefit Street. I lived on 195 Benefit Street, which is apparently right down the block from his house.
Interesting. Yeah, well, I'm a huge fan, so I'm jealous.
I lived in a basement apartment. I lived in this grim basement apartment in the early 80s in Providence. It was horrible.
Yeah.
A horrible city. No offense to any of your listeners who might currently live there, but man, I was sure glad to get out of there. But that's another story.
Yeah. Well, I mean, cities. It depends on how you are living in that city, with the people that you know, the things that you're doing, the places that you frequent. People say Baltimore is a horrible city, and I know parts of Baltimore that I love and will always love, that I think are beautiful, and other people come there and they're like, oh, this place is like a trash can.
Well, everybody hates Baltimore because they saw The Wire.
Yeah, that's true. That's definitely true. If it's known for The Wire, that is not a good indicator of anything.
Is that East Baltimore?
Yeah, that's where it happened, but to be honest with you, there's places like that all over the city. If you're you walk in any direction too far and you're gonna get into some bad part of town around there. But
Well, one of my best friends is a guy who has one of the most popular occult podcasts called The Cult of Personality. His name's Greg Kaminsky, and he's from your area. He's from Baltimore area. And he says growing up, he didn't see anything like that ever.
yeah, it just depends on where you are. Like I said, there's parts of town that are beautiful architecture and, parks and nature, and then then you walk 2 miles in that direction and it's like, holy crap.
Well, you should see New
But
York
and it was
now.
also better back then. Yeah, New York is another example.
New York has been so badly disfigured by the pandemic that I can't even recognize it. I mean, the architecture of the streets and the buildings is one thing, but culturally, what goes on those streets is unrecognizable to me. It's not the place I grew up in at all.
Yeah.
And I don't like it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, things are really strange these days. That's what we were saying earlier in the conversation. It's a good time to be a recluse or whatever.
Oh, the best.
It's a good totally time to get inside your own mind.
Well, think about it. When did you have the greatest upsurge of radical mystical activity, of people going off into the desert in little communities to escape the horrors of society, to do their thing? Late Rome, for example,
yep.
And the plague times during the Middle Ages. So you got your plague, you got your degeneration of society, you got everything. It's like we're totally set up to have that experience, and it should be appreciated. People shouldn't be sad about these things. They should be happy, because now you could do something insane with your life if you're interested in these certain lines of inquiry.
Yeah, that's definitely a very helpful way of thinking about it. Yeah, you can definitely take that places.
Because if I lived in 1967 in a city like San Francisco, I would be so distracted with going out and engaging in going to concerts and social things and like experiencing all this weird stuff that was going on, that my life would be completely conventional. I would just be a conventional consumer of culture. Right? What a waste. Absolutely. What a waste that would be. Sure, I would have these interesting experiences, all this crazy experimental stuff going on. And there was a lot of experimental stuff going on. I'm not just talking about like stupid rock and roll. I'm talking about real experimental, weird things that people don't generally remember. When I was a little kid, it was all going on, and I caught the very tail end of it in the early 70s in New York. But at this point, it would only distract me.
Yeah, that's how I feel like there's something to be said about having certain experiences, and then there's something to be said about just like getting a clear mind and just like focusing, getting, down to business.
The other musical figure, I gave you a little litany of people to check out. The other person that you should check out, but it'll be hard, is Lamont Young.
Okay.
Lamont Young could be possibly the first ambient composer, but it's really difficult to find his stuff, and it's incredible. And we're worth searching for.
Nice. Yeah. Oh yeah, man. I'm gonna I think I'm gonna probably have like a checklist of like I'd like to put all this together and then have like a list of all these different things that you're recommending, and like I'll search them out and have it so people can just click on it. I would like that to be the final product that we have at the end of this thing. So we'll see if I can make that work, where people can sort of know where to look for the things that you're mentioning here, because I'm sure
Well,
they're all going to be worth looking into.
with Lamont Young, you're not going to find it. You know, you'll try and you'll find some crap, but you're not going to find the real good stuff because he made sure that it was not available. He didn't want it to be available.
Interesting.
Yeah, he's an odd guy. He's a very odd guy. And I never met him, but people who I am friends with know him. And he's a difficult character. But everything else that I mentioned, you could find.
Nice.
Everything else
Yeah.
that I
So
mentioned.
when was he releasing music then?
I would say that he started composing probably in the late 40s.
Oh, okay.
And the majority of the things that I consider to be really interesting were between the late 60s and the 80s.
Nice.
And they were not official releases. They were, I don't know what you call them, recordings that he made that were sometimes played in public. And what happened with Lamont Young's music is that I would only be able to find it when it was played on the radio. It couldn't be purchased. So I would tape it off, radio stations like WKCR in New York.
Nice. Yeah, that is definitely interesting. So it was like he was playing it live, or just he only made the recordings available to the radio stations?
Actually, what would happen where I got it from was stations like WKCR, which was Columbia University's radio station, would invite Lamont Young into the studio, and he would bring with him digital audio tapes of his music that were not released, and he would play them all. And I would be there at the button, and I would record the whole
that
thing.
is so interesting.
Yeah.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah. There's one series of recordings that he did with what he called his big band. And what it really was, I'll never know. But the titles of these pieces were sonic designation of waveform frequencies. And he would give this elaborate map of vibratory waveform numbers, coordinates in some system. He was actually a student of Indian music and understood drones on a very sophisticated level, because he was a student of Pandit Pran Nath. He wasn't Carnatic. I think he was Hindustani, but he was an Indian vocalist who had this profoundly subtle way of approaching microtones. He was a microtonal musician. And there's one raga called a Malkuns that was recorded of Pandit Pran Nath, which actually has Lamont Young on tambura.
Nice.
And if you ever get that one, it has a black cover. It's called Malkuns, something midnight. And Lamont Young put it out, Pandit Pran Nath. It is one of the most beautiful pieces of music in existence. Just
I'll have to look into that.
Incredible.
That really cool.
That's definitely worth seeking. Pandit Pran Nath, all his recordings are great, but that one in particular is super great. So Lamont Young was known as an underground guy throughout the 60s. Everybody who was into this stuff knew who he was, but almost nobody had his records. And there were some records put out. So I had to wait until I think it was 1982, where they had a Lamont Young festival on WKCR. And I just stayed up, I think, for 3 days, taped the entire thing.
Nice.
And I did that a number of times with them, because these people would be New York guys who were local.
Yeah, that's
cool. The Dream of the Tortoise Step Up Transformer, something like that, was one of his titles. I mean, I still have them. I have them on cassette.
Yeah.
From recording the radio.
Yeah, well, as you said with your records, you might want to consider digitizing that, at least for your own private collection, just in case one day the cassettes don't live up to history as well. Because you got cassettes laying around that are starting to deteriorate.
Yeah, you got to contend with tape hiss.
Yeah,
which takes a big part of the frequency bandwidth and basically kills it.
Yeah.
And then you start getting a drop off in terms of high frequencies, and you don't want to use a filter, like
Yeah.
a Dolby or something, because then you get no high
Yeah.
frequencies
Then
whatsoever.
you cut a bunch of stuff out of it. Yeah.
Yeah, you fiddle around with EQ, or you meet somebody who's good at sound engineering,
Yeah.
and they could help you EQ your way into something listenable. This is definitely an area where people can have a talent restoring dull old recordings on tape, on analog tape. Can be done. You just boost the hell out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Boost the right places. Yeah, I was trying to salvage some of my old band's practice recordings from like the late 90s that were stored in horrible conditions, that like there were all sorts of crazy things that happened with those tapes that I was trying to work out.
So you were a musician?
Yeah, I've never done anything, nothing like ever, popular, or we didn't release any official albums. But yeah, I used to do vocals for a metal band in the late 90s.
Metal band?
Yeah, just for the fun of it.
Yeah, I tried to be a musician and I found that I just had no talent, so I just stopped.
Yeah, we just had too many youthful people going in the wrong directions, opposite directions, drug directions. Everything just fell apart. So
Right?
then we all went about our lives. And so when you're in a band, it's like you have every band member is another girlfriend or wife. So if there's 5 people in the band, it's like you're having a relationship with 5 people at once. It's hard to hold together. That's why it's so much, that's what I was saying earlier, it's so much better with dark ambient musicians. You can just turn off the program for 5 years and then say, all right, I'm going to make an album. And you don't have to call anybody. You just turn the thing back on and do it.
Do you have any interest into the very sparse, fine ambient experimental recordings, like some of the ones that are coming out of Europe, like Bernard Gunter or even Steve Roden or people like that? Do you have any interest in that stuff
I
at
don't
all?
know much about it. I might be interested, but it's not come across my radar. So at the moment, no, but that's not to say I wouldn't be interested in it.
Steve Roden is an interesting case in point because he has things that are so subtle and ambient that if you were in a room, you might not know that there was anything on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that can be very cool too. I've heard some albums that do things like that, where a lot of times it's usually like fully field recordings driven. But if it were actual, drones, whatever kinds of soundscapes, that could, if it sets the right atmosphere, then yeah, I mean that's all I'm ever looking for, is something that sets the atmosphere correctly.
Right. Well, in that sense, you're weighing 2 different aesthetic priorities against each other.
Yeah.
One is the idea of creating an evocative sensation in an atmosphere.
Mhm.
The other is an undetermined fiddling around with elements as a provocation. And the problem with the ambient music that is delicate in that regard is that it never actually evokes specific atmospheric feelings. It hovers in this territory where you're not even really sure what the hell's going on, but either it's interesting or it's not.
Well, I have a harder time with those in general, but sometimes it can be good stuff.
Sometimes it could be really interesting because if something is going on and you don't know what it is and it doesn't evoke, a particular strong rasa or quality, and yet you like it, yet it's provoking you to think that you're hearing spatial relationships, right?
Yeah.
Delicate things in the forefront, in the background, somewhere over to the side. You're creating a landscape. And sometimes it's not the atmosphere or the feeling that makes the landscape, but the mapping of the points.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because if you're creating, look over here, look over here, look over here, and you could deeply engaged in that process of finding your way. But if it's a bunch of artsy fartsy yahoos who are pretentiously making, rattling some nuts in a cigar box,
Yeah.
like I don't know how you feel about, for example, John Cage.
Yeah, I'm not familiar.
Well, John Cage is known for doing some of the most pretentious music ever made. He's like the granddaddy of all this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it depends. I like I said, I'm gonna have to check a lot of these things out. It's there's so much here that there's so many things that have happened in the ambient music's history that I still haven't fully grasped for myself yet. So, um, yeah, I'm gonna have to look into these. And
okay, here's another one for your list. Get the number pieces by John Cage. They're known by numbers. And there's a record label called Mode that put out a huge amount of John Cage's number pieces in different configurations. And this, you could say, is one of the great predecessors of the ambient music movement.
nice.
Definitely John Cage factors in as one of the, I wouldn't say founding fathers, but certainly strong early influences.
Yeah, well, that's cool. Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, well, I think I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up here for today. I would like to, finish reading your books and, look into some of these different albums that you're talking about. And I would definitely like to have a follow-up conversation with you either, sometime in the near future or, maybe a little bit further down the road, whatever works out between the two of us. But
Great.
You've brought up so many interesting things today, and this conversation has become way more interesting and crossed way more territory than I would have ever expected when you first contacted me.